I'm about to kick a really big beehive. Hi all, I'm Israel and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. Today's video may or may not rustle some feathers, depending on who's watching, as I wanted to discuss why I personally can't stand the genre of reggaeton. Now usually I don't like posting videos that are negative for the pure sake of being negative, as I don't really see that as productive for me or anyone watching. I mean, I have the odd rant video here and there, but those are generally recounting things that have happened in the past that I've now emotionally moved on from, and I'm only discussing because I think they have some entertainment value in their absurdity. This topic, on the other hand, is something that I do still feel strongly about, particularly as someone who produces music myself. The reason I decided to talk about it anyway though is because I realized that it all boils down to a moral stance I have, and so my goal is to ultimately make this video a means of standing up for what's right, rather than just aimlessly ranting. The key word being aimless though, as I certainly still have a lot to rant about here. So anyway, first of all, what is reggaeton? Well, reggaeton's a style of music that's listened to around the world, but in particular is extremely popular in Latin American countries, which is where it comes from. In terms of how it sounds, modern reggaeton is quite a bit like a modern mainstream hip-hop, in that it's usually electronically produced with very minimal sound design, and then there'll be some vocals that are either rap or a kind of laid-back singing across just a few notes. The key differentiator is that reggaeton tracks have what's known as a dembo beat. This is a type of rhythm that's instantly recognizable. Basically, when you hear the being played usually by a kick and a snare, that's the dembo beat. There are some other genres that use this beat, but nowadays, reggaeton is far and away the most popular genre to have it, so if you hear a song with this rhythmic pattern, it's quite likely reggaeton. So that's the long and short of it, but if you want to know a little more, such as the history of reggaeton, I actually did another video last week where I went into a little more detail on it, along with several other genres that are popular in Colombia. Okay, so what is it exactly about this genre that drives me nuts? Well, honestly, everything. That might sound like a cop-out answer, and don't worry, I'm going to get into specifics in a moment, but I think this is an important point to highlight. See, to me, this is what separates reggaeton from most other music genres. Like with other genres, even if they're not checking every single box, they'll usually excel in at least one area. For instance, if you listen to a lot of the good hip-hop music, it mightn't always necessarily be that melodic, but that's okay, because the point of those tracks is the complex rhythmic flow in the rapping and the creativity of the lyrics. Or another example, if you look at something like tech house, right? It's not always that melodically interesting, and like most house music, the rhythm isn't particularly novel, but the focal point of it is the meticulous industrial sound design, which more than makes up for everything it lacks. One final example I'll give, the Colombian genre of vallenato. I don't actually enjoy this genre, and yet I still respect it. Although I don't think there's a lot of variety here, at least not in traditional vallenato, I can still concede that there's some skill to it in all that piano accordion noodling, and you can really hear the expressiveness in it. Again, the point I'm trying to make with all these examples is that music doesn't need to stand out on all dimensions. It doesn't need to be melodically interesting, and rhythmically interesting, and sonically interesting, and lyrically interesting. Even if there's just one of these things that a tune excels in, if it does it well, that can be enough to convey a profound expression and, well, make it interesting. And this right here is the issue I have with reggaeton. There is no standout element that's a saving grace for it. It's just, on every level, really uninspired and boring. It isn't melodically interesting, or rhythmically interesting, or sonically interesting, or lyrically interesting, or interesting in any other conceivable way. It's just all-round bland and dull to the point of being annoying. But let's talk specifically on how it falls short on each individual element. So first of all, melodically. Now this is something I admittedly put more weight in, as I really love more than anything else when a tune is melodically alluring, but I appreciate that there's more to music than just this, as I've just described. Still, if you are going to look at reggaeton from a melodic perspective, there's really not much going on here. I'd even go as far as saying that it's an attribute of the genre to be intentionally anti-melodic. Like with any chord progressions you hear, it sounds like there's a concerted effort to just make it the most drab thing you've ever heard. This is one of the many things that really contributes to the inexpressive, lackadaisical vibe that's so prevalent in this music. I can see it being argued that this whole not happy, not sad, but somewhere in the middle kind of vibe is part of the appeal, and don't get me wrong, I don't have any inherent issue with going this route. In fact, recently over on my music channel, I did a review for the new Z album that just came out, and one of the things I said I liked about that was how emotionally ambiguous a lot of it is. The difference with that though is that it still manages to be evocative and alluring. Melodically, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, like songs that switch back and forth between major and minor, for instance. In reggaeton though, it's not emotionally ambiguous because of some clever melodic interplay or anything like that. It's emotionally ambiguous because of how dead set it is on not being emotionally expressive in any way at all. Then in terms of melody, which is usually carried by the vocals, again, super boring. It's typical that they'll restrict themselves to covering just a small handful of notes within less than an octave that they don't seem to have the range to ever break out of, which then gets auto-tuned up the creek. For stylistic purposes, of course. Now, everything I've just mentioned is bad enough already, but it's made all the worse when you consider that reggaeton's known to be extremely repetitive and monotonous, and rarely seems to go anywhere or evolve. So if you're thinking, oh well, at least I only have to put up with this annoying part for another 4 bars or so, nah, that's the whole song, my dude. But hey, to be fair, a lot of what I've described so far could also describe a lot of other genres that I admittedly do like, and I'll concede that not all music needs to be super profound. Melodic intricacy isn't a requirement for a track to be good, but as I said earlier, if it doesn't have this, then good music will typically compensate for that in one area or another, such as having interesting production. Okay then, so let's look at the production for a bit in reggaeton. Or should I say, the lack thereof. And I don't mean in the sense that it's more live instrumentation or anything like that, I mean that there's just not a lot of anything here. I realize that's not inherently a bad thing. I mean, if what's there is interesting, then that's all that matters, right? Yeah, well, the problem is that what's there is, once again, not interesting at all. On the contrary, I can't think of any other music genre that has production lazier than this. First of all, if you listen to the drums, you'll notice in a lot, maybe even most of this music, that the entire track is a kick and a snare playing a dembo beat on repeat with almost nothing else. Whatever else there is probably only makes up 10% of the drum track maximum. Having a simple kick and snare on repeat like this almost exclusively is just so lazy, and it's made all the worse when you consider that it's not only 90% or more of the drum track, it's also arguably the focal point of the entire track. In other words, once you've got this beat in, you're well on your way. Just to give you an idea of how little effort this takes, I'll do it myself in less than 30 seconds. Ready? Okay, so first we'll find a kick. That one will do. Then we will add a snare. That one will do. Make a little dembo beat out of this. There we go. Now let's spread that out for 3 minutes or so in the playlist. Bring that back. And maybe just make a little gap for the intro. Done. Yeah, that's almost the entire drum track done in less than 30 seconds. Now, I get that some people might argue that having a simple repetitive dembo beat like this is what makes this music so good, because it's incredibly catchy. And yeah, I get that. In fact, I don't even have a problem with this rhythm. What I have a problem with is how little there is supporting it. There really are no excuses here, because you absolutely can make a dembo-driven track with some actual production value and interesting supporting rhythms. If you don't believe me, go listen to Plume by Caravan Palace, and notice how the drum track in that has enough intricacy to sound like there was some actual effort put into it, along with the rest of the production in the song. Again, you don't always need intricate production in a track, but if nothing else is interesting, then I mean it's kind of the only thing you've got left to make an impression with. By the way, if you're wondering what the remaining 2/3 of the production are outside of the basic drum track, well, it's really nothing to get excited about. Admittedly, a lot of the other sound design is less repetitive and predictable than the drums, but I feel like it's the opposite extreme. It just feels so arbitrary and unfocused that it makes it really hard to follow. And I don't mean in the sense of it being clever and complex like some dissonant jazz music, I mean that it feels so unintentional to the point of being instantly forgettable, almost as though it was produced by AI. Not that it is. I mean, most of these big acts have ghost producers, because apparently producing something as lazy as this is still too much effort. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Maybe they bring something else to the table, like a beautiful voice that's super auto-tuned and doesn't span more than 5 notes. Okay, you know what? Maybe they've got a knack for contributing some deeply inspired lyrics, eh? Okay, in all seriousness, before I talk about the lyrics and reggaeton, I just want to level with you a bit here. I realize that everything I've said up until now is a technical critique, and I understand that basing the value of music on this alone may arguably be a gross simplification. Music is much more than the sum of its parts, and although some people may choose to listen to stuff based on how impressive it is, for most people, their preferences are based, at least primarily, on how a given track makes them feel. So does this make this entire video redundant then? I mean, you can critique a track based on the merit of the craft as much as you like, but at the end of the day, if it's resonated with someone, well then who are you to tell them they're wrong? When it comes to art, I think Ego, the food critic from Ratatouille, sums it up pretty well when he says that, in the grand scheme of things, the average piece of junk is probably more meaningful than our criticism designating it so. See, with all the criticism I've given here, I've been appealing to skill, effort, and creativity as metrics for greatness. But if someone likes something regardless of this criteria, well then what does that criticism even matter? I mean, they just like it, so what are you going to do, critique their subjective feelings? At that point, there's really not any standard you can appeal to anymore. Except one. See, you might not be able to tell people that their feelings about something are wrong from a technical perspective, as again, you're using an objective standard to critique something inherently subjective, but artistic merit aside, I think there's also a lot to say here from a moral perspective. Which brings us nicely into the final thing I wanted to critique here, the lyrics in reggaeton. Simply put, the lyrics in this music are often known to not only be very lazily written, but also extremely superficial and vulgar due to how blatantly and shamelessly they objectify women. I mean, I don't have any inherent problem with music about female beauty, but there's a way to express that tastefully, which reggaeton does not. I won't read any examples here because I don't want YouTube to apply any restrictions to this video, but if you want just a quick idea of the kind of absolute lyrical slop served up by this genre, go read the lyrics to Pera by J Balvin or Safaera by Bad Bunny. Both of these are just so unabashedly demeaning towards women, it's honestly sad that some people think this is okay. Like the first song, Pera, is basically themed around this idea that women are dogs, and don't be mistaken, this goes far beyond referring to a woman as a This takes the metaphor to the nth degree, talking about stuff like having canine rabies and going to the kennel, and a bunch of other stuff that's just so degrading. If you do think I'm being prudish though, well then go check out the music video for this, which goes as far as to have men walking black women on leashes, while a female vocalist Tokischa twerks in a dog kennel. Thankfully this video did get a ton of backlash and was removed due to the controversy, although you can still find it unofficially. Either way, it is a prime example of the kind of noxious culture these artists often foster. And I mean, that was just one example, but trust me, there are plenty more. I realize that the rebuttal to this might be that there are a lot of other genres that also have music with demeaning lyrics, but I'd say that the difference with reggaeton is that this kind of degenerate smut has virtually become one of the defining attributes of the genre. Yes, you could say that hip-hop has its fair share of this too, but it's honestly not nearly as ubiquitous or genre-defining as it is with reggaeton. I mean, with hip-hop, it's a lot more a specific type of hip-hop where you'll find that sort of thing, but you really can't pin that on the whole genre more broadly. Within reggaeton, on the other hand, you pretty much can. Yes, with a genre this big, of course there are going to be exceptions, but that's exactly what they are. Exceptions to the rule. The fact is, the majority of reggaeton is overtly licentious, which is something that just can't be said about the vast majority of other music genres out there. Alright then, so even if all this is true, you might ask why I'm so bothered by it. I mean, there are plenty of bad things in the world, so what's notable about reggaeton to warrant a video like this? Well, let me tell you. See, in Spanish-speaking countries in particular, this stuff is everywhere. In my time living in Colombia, for instance, I can tell you now, I could not escape it. Whether I was at the mall, walking down the street, or in an Uber, this music is played relentlessly. And when you consider everything I've just described regarding the lyrics in reggaeton, you realize just how messed up it is that so many people choose to consume this. When it's become such a pervasive part of culture though, I can see how it's easy to fall into. In Colombia and likely other Latin countries, there are, for instance, entire radio stations dedicated to reggaeton almost exclusively, with millions of people tuning in every day. Needless to say, it is one of the most popular genres of music in Latin America, probably the most popular genre, and that right there is where the main problem lies. You kind of have to wonder what it does to the collective conscience of a society when something as vulgar as this becomes so culturally prominent. I mean, I understand that many would say that they tune out of the lyrics and that they listen to it because they just like the vibe or whatever. Whether that's true or not though, you can't deny that the artists behind this music are still widely revered, and I find it hard to believe that you can look up to someone for their music whilst simultaneously disassociating them from everything they've ever sung about in said music. Like, no, let's be real here. People don't like these artists in spite of their edginess, they like them because of their edginess. That whole rebellious image they put out where they act like pimps and flex their wealth, that's the kind of superficial crap that a good chunk of society celebrates. What's more, the affluence of these artists only further validates this kind of culture. Not only are they pushing moral boundaries, but they're doing it in this very mainstream, trendy, and therefore socially encouraged space, which makes consuming this stuff quite appealing for a lot of people. It just makes decadence more palatable, and so now, all of a sudden, people have a culturally accepted outlet to satiate an indulgence they might not otherwise entertain. At least not proudly. But okay, you know what? Let's say I'm totally wrong on this, and that most people really are able to tune out of the lyrics in this music when they listen to it, and they only look up to these artists for purely wholesome reasons. Well look, even if all that's true, there's still a big problem here. See, we all know that people are usually products of their environment. The things we experience in our daily lives, the people we spend time with, and the content we consume All of these things shape us into the people we are and compound on who we already might be. It happens naturally, a lot of the time we don't even notice, but we're constantly conforming to things that leave an impression on us. When people argue therefore that they tune out of the lyrics in reggaeton and that they don't condone this kind of dehumanizing sexualization that it promotes, what they're really saying is that they've been conformed by beliefs in their lives that are not in alignment with these messages. The kinds of life experiences they've had, the kinds of people they've hung around, and the specific information they've absorbed throughout their lives have all amalgamated into a set of beliefs that are in opposition to the worldview that's promoted in reggaeton. And with those beliefs in place, the lyrics of reggaeton aren't something they feel themselves relating to on any meaningful level. Now, I would argue that it's still unhealthy to listen to music that contradicts your moral standards, but putting that aside for the moment, the important thing to ask here would be, well, what about people who have a worldview that's not unlike the one promoted in reggaeton? Or heck, what about those who are still young and impressionable, who are still in the process of accumulating life experience and don't yet have any concrete moral credo? Well, personally, I believe that in the absence of a compelling alternative, it's a natural human tendency to conform to what's popular in the world around us by default. I mean, when you have stuff that you constantly see all around you that everyone's choosing to engage in because it's popular, and you've never considered or been given a reason not to engage in it yourself, well, then why wouldn't you? Popularity is such a compelling factor that even people who do have good morals often still struggle to resist pursuing something that goes against their values if it happens to be popular. With that in mind, can you imagine how tough it must be for people who've barely formed those values at all and therefore have little to no internal resistance they have to contend with? Really doesn't look good for them, hey? All that being said, the point I'm trying to make here is that this is the exact dilemma reggaeton's involved in. It's an extremely ubiquitous part of culture in Latin America. There's over 100 million people who listen to it. The lyrics are a total indictment on basic morality, and as we just established, there are going to be a whole lot of people, easily in the millions, who hardly have any resistance against its content, and in fact enjoy it, at least in part, because of the brain rot degeneracy of its lyrics. And that right there, that is the biggest problem with reggaeton. Because when you have millions of people not only engaging with something as morally depraved as this, but celebrating specifically the parts of it that make it so immoral, you better believe that that has an effect on society, which is why I'm bothering to make this video. Now look, I get it, there may be people watching this who think I'm some prude or music snob who only ever listens to classical music or metal or something and thinks all quote-unquote urban music is trash, but I promise you that's really not the case. Like honestly, my most listened to genre is EDM, which a lot of people consider to be kinda lowbrow, but I like it. As for hip-hop, which might be the genre that gets the most comparisons to reggaeton for its influence, I really have no problems with that either. I mean, yes, there is a certain style of hip-hop that I loathe, but it's far from the entire genre, and there's plenty of great hip-hop that I enjoy quite a lot. I also want to shut down any notion that I might have some prejudice against Latin American music. Once again, that's completely untrue. My favorite genre of all time is bossa nova, which is obviously Brazilian. And as for Hispanic music more specifically, I actually really love salsa, to the point where I even went as far as to write a salsa song earlier this year. All that's to say, I don't take an issue with reggaeton for any cultural reasons. Truly, that's got nothing to do with it. I also don't have some grudge against music for being mainstream and commercial. I only have a grudge when it's mainstream and commercial if it also happens to be morally bankrupt, which I believe is the case here. But okay, I think I've made my point loud and clear now. While it's all well and good to identify a problem though, you still gotta ask, well, what are you gonna do about it? And that is a good question. I realised that in the past there has been a fairly dogmatic reaction to reggaeton, to say the least. Like when it first formed in Puerto Rico, there were instances of authorities who'd go around confiscating reggaeton tapes from record stores and would sometimes even issue fines to stores that stock the music, along with occasionally arresting reggaeton artists under obscenity laws. I just want to be clear that as outspoken as I am about reggaeton, this is not an approach I'm here to advocate in the slightest. I believe people should be legally allowed to make, promote, and distribute the music they want, regardless of its content. If any music platform or radio have policies about excluding certain content that promotes illegal activity, that's fine, those are usually private companies, they are not the law. But the moment you get the state trying to censor it, that's when things start getting a little blurry in terms of free speech and all that fun stuff. So no, I'm not going to suggest that governments censor reggaeton or anything like that. Really, I reckon the best possible outcome to shake up the status quo is honestly for people's mindsets about it to change. I mentioned before how powerful of an effect it has on people when something is popular in society, but I also think the opposite is true. If something becomes unpopular, or more specifically uncool, a lot of people will stop wanting to associate with it. You'll find plenty of examples of this where things that have had astronomical popularity have suddenly nosedived after the cultural perception around them has changed. Just look at Facebook for instance. I remember when I was in early high school, there was almost a level of peer pressure to get Facebook, because it was seen as this platform where all the cool people hung out and compared how many friends on it they had. Nowadays though, a lot of people associate Facebook with older demographics who aren't at the forefront of the cultural zeitgeist, and post from random spam pages they don't care about. Of course, there are also plenty of things outside the tech world that have seen a cultural decline, like, I don't know, fur coats, or smoking, or single-use plastics, or big wallets, and a whole bunch of other stuff, so yeah, I think you can guess where I'm going with this. I think the most effective thing that would get less people listening to reggaeton would be if it were to become uncool. Now, thankfully, there has been some cultural shift in that society today seems to be less tolerant than ever regarding feminine objectification, at least when it's men who are doing the objectifying. That stance is obviously in direct contradiction to the common themes of reggaeton music, and so a lot of artists have thankfully been forced to reevaluate what they write about in order to maintain public respect. That said, I would argue that this line still needs to be a lot stricter. Although there have been cases where artists have faced backlash from fans, like with J Balvin and his song Pera, as I mentioned earlier, this only seems to happen when artists take it to the absolute extreme. The more casual objectification that exists in so many other reggaeton songs though largely goes unchecked. I'd really like to think that it's going to become trickier for these artists to maintain relevancy as time goes on if they keep up with this kind of content, but again, when it comes to things that are popular, people seem a lot more willing to turn a blind eye, so I kinda doubt this is going to be an overnight change. The only other way I could see reggaeton become uncool is really if people just get sick of it. Could that realistically happen though? Well, again, I kinda doubt it. Reggaeton's been popular since the early noughties, and has only gotten bigger since then. 30-ish years at the forefront of pop culture is honestly some crazy staying power. It sort of makes me worried that it's going to be a permanent fixture as a timeless traditional genre like salsa or cumbia. In terms of evolution, the future definitely seems bleak here too. Like, if you look at how reggaeton's changed since its early days, it seems to be on a trajectory of just becoming worse and worse. It's just gotten even less melodic, more auto-tuned, and more monotonous as time goes on, and I struggle to see anything on the horizon that could break that trend. So yeah, things really aren't looking good overall. I reckon the best we can do at the moment is to just introduce other genres to our friends who listen to reggaeton. If they have even an iota of musicality, maybe they'll eventually realize how abysmal it is once they probably listen to literally anything else. I mean, speaking from my own experience, there have definitely been periods of my life where I started listening to a new genre that was just so much more interesting and compelling than what I was listening to beforehand, that I kind of just stopped listening to the stuff from before entirely. It's like when you get a taste of the good life, you don't want to go back, you know? I mean, that whole tactic probably isn't going to work on a mass scale, but at least it could make a change for some people, I guess. Anyway, I've gone on for a good while now, so I'm going to close this one here. I'm sorry if this one was a little grim, but I do think it's something that's really worth talking about. Speaking of which, I would love to know what your thoughts are on this whole topic. You know, what do you think of reggaeton? And is there anything that could be done to improve this whole situation? Feel free to let me know in the comments below, along with any future video idea suggestions if you'd like. Otherwise, thanks for watching all this way. If you enjoyed this, go ahead and like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!